Hey, welcome everyone. We'll start in a minute or two as more people are joining us today. Thanks for being with us. I also before we start, I just wanted to give a special welcome. I'm seeing some of the people who are here today and seeing some of the incoming class of Public Humanities Master's students. So we're really pleased to see you today and sort of get a chance to welcome you early before you arrive in Providence, if you haven't already arrived. Okay. Why don't we begin? We are really pleased to welcome Justin Reid back in some ways, even though he's on Zoom, because he's been at the Public Humanities Center before a few years ago for an unconference on Curatescape that we did. His talk today is called Afro-Virginia, Black Placekeeping and Power. I'm Marissa Brown. I'm the Assistant Director for Programs at the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage. So I will introduce Justin and then he will give his presentation, which we're excited to hear from. And first I'd like to read the land acknowledgement that the Native American Indigenous Studies Department at Brown has crafted and uses. In our efforts to create a meaningful acknowledgement of the Indigenous peoples and their connections to the land that Brown University occupies, Native American Indigenous Studies Initiative and others at the university are following a protocol to carefully consider what this acknowledgement should be according to the Indigenous peoples connected to this place. Addressing this important effort in full depth and according respect to all who are invested in this work will take time, deliberation, and care. It may take a number of months and perhaps years to complete. We are committed to engaging in a complete dialogue with local tribal peoples to ensure that the process is comprehensive. Our actions and statements will be guided by dialogue with local tribes and will seek to address our history and interactions with Indigenous peoples of the area. That's some of it. For people who are interested in reading sort of where the process is as Brown creates a university-wide land acknowledgement, I can put a link in the chat box when we start. Today, we would like to welcome Justin. Justin is a public historian and a leader in cultural heritage advocacy, stewardship, and philanthropy. He's director of community initiatives at Virginia Humanities, where he supports cultural sustainability partnerships statewide and manages the General Assembly's African American Cultural Resources Task Force. He previously worked for the Moton Museum, a National Historic Landmark in his hometown, Farmville, Virginia, and oversaw the 2013 opening of its national award-winning $6 million permanent exhibition on civil rights era school desegregation and student activism. His passions include decolonial place-based learning, digital and public humanities, and culture-sustaining economic development, especially in the rural US Upper South. He's a graduate of Johns Hopkins University and the College of William and Mary, where he co-founded the W&M Lemon Project on race, public history, and memory. He currently serves as a governor-appointed board member of the Virginia Tourism Corporation. Thank you so much, Justin, for being here. As people know who have been to our lunch talks before, Justin will be presenting for 25 minutes or so, and then after that, we'll have time for questions and conversation. If you have something you'd like to say, just let me know in the chat box. I'll let you know where you are in the order and I'll unmute you so that you can ask it yourself. So this is less webinar-y and more interactive. So thanks for being here, everyone. And really thanks, Justin, for making time. I also just wanted to say Justin has a 1-month-old, which he just shared with us before. So really, really thanks for making time for us today. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna share my screen really quickly. I'm very excited to join you all today. I don't suspect I'll have to run out for anything crazy. I'm zooming from home and the 1-month-old is here, but I think we're all set. So let's see. let's see. Got it. So I believe everyone can see that now. All right, so I'm gonna really talk about, I guess, my life. This will be a little biographical, but one of my filmmaking friends has half jokingly referred to me as the Forrest Gump of Virginia Black public history. So, you take that for however you interpret it. But, I think in talking about, some of my experiences in my life over the last 3 decades, it definitely, I think, tracks many of the developments that we've seen in Virginia when it comes to public history. But I did want to start off with this photo here and kind of just introduce you all to my family. I think so much of our work in the public humanities is shaped by our identity. And I know that's very true for me. And in my work, I've come to realize that it's very informed by my rural identity, I would say more than anything. Being from rural Virginia, Southern Virginia, historians have described Southside Virginia, where I call home, to be the part of Virginia that feels the most like the Deep South. And so that was a place that I grew up. But I also grew up in a very close-knit community, surrounded by my extended family. This photo here, just a bunch of my cousins. I'm standing right here, hugging my cousin Danny, who I believe is my fourth cousin. But this was a weekend where we were just kind of hanging out, and there are a lot of us here. We should just take a family photo. But the land where this photo was taken has actually now been in my family for 7 generations. My cousin Danny, who I'm hugging, has a 1-year-old that she just welcomed, and so he represents the 7th generation to steward this land in Southern Virginia, Cumberland County in particular, right outside the town of Farmville. I think, being Black and rural, and then being from a family that has been able to steward land over several generations is something that continues to shape my ideas around placemaking and placekeeping and environmental stewardship. I descend from a formerly enslaved man, my great-great-grandfather, Reverend Jake, who was able to attend seminary. He attended the Virginia Baptist Seminary, which at the time that he was there prided itself on being autonomous from other Black institutions that were white controlled. The Virginia Baptist Seminary was entirely Black led, Black controlled, and Black funded. And I think that ideology has definitely shaped my perspective. And then one generation after Reverend Jake was my great grandmother, who attended Hampton Institute. She graduated in 1917. And according to oral tradition, the reason this land is still in our family is because of her. My grandmother, in talking about my grandma Helen, my grandma said her father was a so-called farmer. That's what she said. But it was truly my grandma Helen and her ingenuity and her commitment that helped really sustain our family across several generations. At Hampton, when she was there, they were just transitioning into a liberal arts curriculum. For those of you familiar with Hampton University, it was founded for Native Americans and newly freed Black people. And it was, for much of its early history, a vocational institute that emphasized self-reliance and self-determination. When my great-grandmother was there, Hampton was transitioning into a liberal arts curriculum. And so she was the beneficiary of both the vocational education and the liberal arts education. And to this day, I can see how that continues to influence my family and how we move through the world and our connection to place. And I think the last thing I kind of want to say about my family and how it shapes my work, in addition to priding ourselves on self-determination and autonomy. I think there also comes an assertion of rights. Having property in the rural South afforded my family a certain level of autonomy to be active in the civil rights movement. And I would also say having very strong and influential women, we were very much a matrilineal family, afforded a certain autonomy, particularly to the women who inherited land. They were able to leave difficult marriages. They were able to be involved in civic activism because of their connection to the land. So I went from rural Southern Virginia to William and Mary, which is in, I believe folks will know Colonial Williamsburg. You've heard of it, I'm sure. But it truly was a culture shock for me to go from, the somewhat remote, close-knit, predominantly Black rural space to a place like William and Mary, where really for the first time in my life, I encountered generational wealth in a way that I hadn't before. And not to say that my family was unwealthy or disadvantaged, but the extent of wealth was something that was really quite new to me and wasn't something that I had seen until I'd come to William and Mary. And I think for much of my time there, I felt like a fish out of water. Again, even though there were other Black students, you weren't seeing many students from rural communities at William and Mary. But one thing that I think really benefited me, and it connects back to Brown University, the work that had been occurring at Brown around the history of slavery was having a huge impact across the country. And it coincided with my time at William and Mary. And so we were beginning to have those conversations about the true history of William and Mary and who the true founders were. And this building here, the Rim building, happens to be the oldest college building, extant college building in the United States, still in use. And at the time that I was there, we were really beginning to better, I think, interpret this space. I think in the moments at William and Mary when I really, at certain times considered leaving, I would come to this building and I would think about, the enslaved people who had constructed the Rim building. Construction began in 1695 on the Rim. And it was kind of that connection to place and truly understanding the deeper history and those who were involved in constructing, this really beautiful Georgian structure that had withstood centuries. And in those moments where I felt like giving up and I felt like leaving William and Mary, I could look to that history and I could think about, the men and the women who had constructed this place and recognize that, the same resilience and the same strength and the brilliance that existed in them was handed down to me. And so those were the types of evening reflections that sustained me while I was at William and Mary. There's a lot that happened during my time. It was a tumultuous time. We were engaged in a culture war of our own that caused our president to resign. And in that moment of upheaval, as student activists, we were able to really hold the administration accountable. And one of the things that we wanted to ensure happened was that there was a full investigation of the college's history, one that really centered the enslaved community and elevated and shared their story more broadly. And so from this student activism and from the mentorship and support of several key faculty, we were able to establish the Lemon Project. It initially began as a term-limited research initiative, but 10 years later, it continues with no ending in sight. And so from this work, we've been able to accomplish some really extraordinary things at William and Mary. William and Mary is the oldest institution in the South. For us to undertake this level of research and engagement with the local community around this history, I think is is incredibly important and serves as a model for other Southern institutions that are beginning to grapple with this history a lot more. And I think, again, this ties back to the work that was happening at Brown. So I had a somewhat circuitous route. I ended up, leaving Williamsburg. I came back to Williamsburg to be at Colonial Williamsburg. I was briefly there. I worked in the nonprofit sector, kind of adjacent to kind of public history and historic preservation. We were involved in doing a lot of survey work in urban communities in Virginia where we were based. But ultimately, I ended up leaving Colonial Williamsburg and returning home. Again, I think there was this pull that I felt, and I felt that throughout my college experience, this I think growing appreciation for home and how unique and special it was. And so ultimately returned back to my hometown, Farmville, Virginia. And so the building you see right here is the Moton High School in Farmville. This building was the all-Black high school. It was constructed in 1939 for 180 students. And by 1951, it had well over 400 students. So if you can imagine this small space being built for 180, having close to 500 students crammed inside of it. Parents have been organizing for years trying to get a new school constructed, and the county leadership refused. And ultimately, the students took matters into their own hands. They decided that they would go on strike. This was in 1951. They were led by a 16-year-old named Barbara Johns. And this strike resulted in a lawsuit that was consolidated with 4 other cases. And today, this consolidated lawsuit, this class action suit, is known as Brown versus the Board of Education. So these students in my hometown represented 75% of the plaintiffs in Brown v. Board of Education. And it began with the strike inside of this building that's now a National Historic Landmark. And it's a history that as a child, I didn't even know about. I'd been to this school. Later, I learned that my great-great-grandmother was instrumental in helping found this school. And it was a history that I think because of how civil rights history was taught in the country, and this more popular narrative that focuses on a very, I think, simplistic national narrative of civil rights history. Many local stories like my own community was lost in that. And in returning home, I not only had the opportunity to learn more about this local history and its national implications and my family's connections to it, but I had the opportunity to share this history with the world. In 2013, we were able to complete a $7 million renovation of this site and new construction on the site. And today, there's actually a group, and you may have heard of them, but at Georgia State University, there's a consortium that's developed that's exploring UNESCO World Heritage status for 12 sites, I believe. It would be a serial nomination. Included in those 12 sites across the South is Moton. And so this experience of coming home and learning a history that hadn't been discussed, and there are a lot of reasons why it hadn't really been discussed. I think a lot of it's connected to the trauma of that history and what occurred afterwards as a result of the Brown lawsuit, and the public schools were closed for 5 years to prevent students from integrating. I think there were a lot of reasons why this history wasn't told to me as a child, but I think one thing that it truly revealed to me was the importance of oral tradition and memory, and how the events of the past continue to shape contemporary generations. Because even as a kid, not knowing this history, in hindsight, I can see how my generation was affected by it. My cousins and I, and how we moved through the world, and the advice and the words of wisdom that were handed down surrounding education and resilience and not giving up and fighting for a decent education. These were all things that were said, and knowing this history helped put that sentiment in a larger context. So I was at Moton for probably a little over 5 years, and the opportunity to come to Virginia Humanities, where I currently work, opened up, and I came to Virginia Humanities. I'm assuming everybody in this program is familiar with kind of the network of NEH state humanities councils. So Virginia Humanities is Virginia State Humanities Council. And I think the opportunity was really enticing because I had a chance to apply so much of what I learned both at Moton, both being at Colonial Williamsburg and at William and Mary and my other experiences. I had a chance to apply a lot of that knowledge to different parts of the state and assist other communities that were grappling with really difficult memories, who were working to really elevate stories that had been suppressed for years and centuries even. But through our work at Virginia Humanities, we're able to not only provide grant making support to local communities, but we're also able to really use our resources to shine light on underknown stories across the state. The Encyclopedia of Virginia is a prime example of that. As one of our programs. It's an online digital publication that attempts to share scholarship more broadly with public audiences. And right now with Virginia Humanities and the Encyclopedia of Virginia, a lot of the work is focusing on ensuring that the content is more inclusive and truly represents the diversity of Virginia. So we're having conversations around queer history in Virginia and the underrepresentation in our content. My colleagues are undertaking a feminist audit of a lot of our content to ensure that women and femmes are represented more equitably in the resources that we're developing for the public. This picture here, I guess I should speak to this. This picture here represents some of the programming that we've done to better contextualize history and space and place. This outdoor exhibition was something that I had an opportunity to work on with a colleague, Maggie Guggenheimer, and Carmenita Higginbotham, who's now the Dean of VCU Arts. But this was an outdoor exhibition called Unseen Seaville. And we worked over 2 semesters with a group of undergraduate students to really explore the Black history throughout Charlottesville. And we paired these various Black historical sites with excerpts from Fires This Time, edited collection by Jesmyn Ward. And each of the quotes that were selected were power washed into the street. And so I don't know if you all are familiar with power washing, but when you power wash a stencil like this and it's removed, the clean portion of the sidewalk reveals the lettering. And so people who were walking past, and in hindsight, this was a pretty crazy project. I would never do it again, but it was a powerful project. And we had, a couple dozen sites all across the city where folks would see these quotes and they were able to then go online and get some of the context behind why that quote was chosen for that site. And so each of the quotes spoke to a lesser known aspect of that site's history. These are all our causes. This quote is actually near the police department and speaks to some of the police violence that we've been witnessing across the country. We had stencils at public libraries, at contemporary businesses that have been gentrified, that had previously been owned by the Black community. But all of these quotes spoke to that lesser known history or some larger societal issue that the site spoke to. And so with Virginia Humanities, the thing that I've appreciated the most, being able to work with communities all across the state and the opportunity to be creative in how we explore Virginia's history and culture. And so this was an opportunity to do that, working with students and local community historians. So I mentioned Encyclopedia of Virginia, and I'm getting ready to wind down now. So Encyclopedia of Virginia received a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to partner with a project called Saving Slave Houses. The person you see to the left here is Joby Hill. who is a preservation architect. She's responsible for reconstructing the slave dwellings at both Monticello and Montpelier. Her project, Saving Slave Houses, was assisting Encyclopedia Virginia in exploring extant slave dwellings across Virginia. We were creating 360 virtual tours of these sites in order to remind Virginians that many of these places still exist, and it's important for the enslaved communities to be centered when we talk about the history of these sites. So in my position as Director of African American Programs at the time, I joined Joby and Encyclopedia Virginia's director, Peter Headland, on several of their survey visits. And at one site, I noticed that the architecture resembled structures that I had seen at the plantation that I knew my family had been enslaved on. And it turned out that that site that we were visiting was owned by relatives of the same family that had owned and enslaved my ancestors. And so when I visited that site, I told Joby, I said, this building looks awfully familiar. And I ultimately took her to Amped Hill, the site you see here. This is a slave dwelling duplex on the property where my ancestors had been enslaved, and I had the opportunity to be a part of the digital documentation of this site. Most of my work and experience has been in civil rights public history. Because of the work of Encyclopedia Virginia and Saving Slave Houses in Joby, in recent years, especially here in Virginia, I've been called on to be more of a descendant voice when it comes to interpreting slavery. And I think there's a noticeable shift across Virginia right now, particularly with sites of enslavement. We're considering questions like cultural rights for these properties. We're exploring issues of self-determination. We're exploring co-stewardship of these sites. I think Montpelier, and many of you may have heard the recent news, is probably the furthest along in this conversation. Montpelier is the home of James Madison. Several years ago, I was able to join a group of colleagues from all across the country for the National Summit for Teaching Slavery. And during the summit, we co-wrote a rubric, a set of best practices for slavery sites and how they should engage descendant communities. And one of the things that we truly emphasized was structural parity in leadership and consultation with descendant communities. Montpelier just announced, and this is a historic victory for descendants of enslaved peoples. Montpelier just announced that the descendants of their enslaved community will now represent the majority on their board of trustees. And so to my knowledge, this is the very first public heritage plantation site to be controlled by its Black descendants. So I'll wrap up shortly. I wanted to kind of discuss where this conversation is going now. And I think three of the people that have been helping lead this work are on stage with me. Hannah Scruggs, to my left here. Hannah Scruggs previously managed descendant engagement for Montpelier. She's now at the National Museum of African American History and Culture as a genealogist and research historian. You have Reid, no known relation, but she is completing her PhD at William & Mary in anthropology. She's an archaeologist that's been leading the descendant engagement at historic Jamestown here in Virginia. And then you have Joby Hill to the far left, far right to you. Joby, again, is the founder of Saving Slave Houses, who really helped deepen my knowledge around historic preservation and architecture. Our focus now is really attempting to empower other communities and other descendants who are interested in reclaiming these ancestral places. This event here was held at Norfolk State University, which is an HBCU in Virginia. This was my last event really before the pandemic hit. But this event was hosted by the General Assembly's African American Cultural Resources Task Force. And this task force was legislated by Delegate Dolores McQuinn, who was instrumental in the monuments conversation and debates we've been having in Virginia. She introduced the legislation that allowed for these monuments to be removed in Virginia, Confederate monuments. So Delegate McQuinn is the founding chair of this task force. And through the task force, we're working to connect Virginians and communities all across the state to these resources that would allow Black determination and co-stewardship of these ancestral sites. So I wanted to just end here. I think these three sites kind of represent the trajectory of a lot of the work. To your left, you see Monticello and their descendant engagement, known as Getting Word Oral History Project, began almost 30 years ago now with the Virginia Humanities grant. There were staff members at Monticello, Senator Stanton, chief among them, who said that this work was important. And interestingly, they had to go outside of the organization at that time and receive external funding in order to begin that oral history project with descendants. And so you fast forward 25, 30 years later, Montpelier in the center there, the National Summit on Teaching Slavery, the rubric for engaging descendant communities is now transforming how these sites all across Virginia are considering how they're led and how the history is researching who's leading that work, with descendants being front and center. And then this last image here on the right is the executive mansion here in Virginia. In the last, I would say 2 years, 3 years if you include these past 16 months, we began having a conversation about the executive mansion in Virginia, which is still a private residence, but is partially open to the public. And it's stewarded by a legislated body. Through our work with the executive mansion, this public state-owned site is now being stewarded by a board that includes 3 descendants. And these were descendants of 3 enslaved communities from 3 different gubernatorial administrations. One of the descendants is actually a direct descendant of the very first governor to inhabit this building in 1813. Governor James Barber fathered children with enslaved women. Her name was Priscilla. So in just these last 2 months, we were able to get a descendant of Priscilla appointed by Governor Northam to the board that now manages the executive mansion. So I think there's a lot more work to do. I think there are some legislative policies that need to be introduced, but I think a lot of our inspiration is coming from the Native rights movement and looking at some of the victories that we saw 20 some years ago. And so when we talk about cultural rights, what does that look like for Black Virginians? When we look at these 3 sites, it's important that we consider them as Black heritage sites and Black spaces that were first and foremost sites of Black community. These enslaved communities and their descendants shaped the land, stewarded the land, constructed the properties, built the wealth, sustained them. When it comes to how these sites are preserved and shared and interpreted with the public, it's important for these descendant communities to have a say in how that's done. And so that's the fight that we're engaged in now here in Virginia. So I'll stop right there. I had a bunch of notes that I just tried to internalize just now. I didn't think through the fact that I couldn't see my Google document at the same time that I was sharing a screen, but I internalized it before the presentation. And I don't think I missed, much of what I was initially planning to say. But again, I do want to emphasize, I think the lack of Black rural voices in these conversations. And there's so much to be gained, I think, when you bring that experience into public humanities. I mean, it's so distinct in so many ways. And if we think about, Black culture, our urban experience in this country is relatively recent. And I think when we begin, I mean, I credit, Jesmyn Ward and, Kiese Lehman and the work that they're doing, Andrea Roberts and the Texas Black Freedom Colonies project that she's leading. I think there's so much that can be gained and explored when we reconnect, I think, to Black rural voices and the descendants of Black enslaved communities that are working to preserve these sites.
Do you want to unshare screen? Oh, awesome. Thank you. So we can see more of everyone. So everyone, I changed the security settings so people can unmute themselves. And I think, I can sort of keep an eye. So if you have a question, you can jump in just verbally or use the chat box or raise your hand using the little icon and ask anything you'd like. And I see a lot of people who I know will have a lot of questions because they're engaged in work that is, I'm sure will be very inspired by what you just shared, Justin. I had a question about your title. I'm interested in placekeeping and what you think the word placekeeping does that preservation doesn't do, and kind of where placekeeping overlaps with preservation and where it doesn't overlap with preservation, and the way we think about those words, what they kind of signify.
Right. Well, I think preservation is obviously a component of placekeeping for sure, but I think the term placekeeping itself, at least I think to the general public who encounters that word, is a little bit broader. I will say, I think preservation as a term is, I think those of us who are engaged in historic preservation have a better sense of what that means, but I think to kind of general audiences, the term itself comes across as if we're attempting to stop change or prevent change, right? And I think placekeeping, conveys a dynamism that I think is present in preservation, but is unfortunately not widely understood. But I think placekeeping to me also involves a lot of the creativity that comes from being able to steward and preserve and protect these places. I think it's important to accept that change is inevitable. And for me, placekeeping acknowledges the fact that how we protect and steward these places might not be identical to how our families and our ancestors have done it, but there are certain things that are handed down that remain and are still important to succeeding generations. And placekeeping to me also allows for a conversation around kind of who's telling the story of a place, and then also how lives are being improved by the telling of that story. I think placekeeping can be used in kind of economic development conversations. And when we talk about the benefits of economic development and how that wealth is shared, I'm using a term like placekeeping ensures that we're centering those who are native to these places and what they want to see happen.
Yeah, it would be, it would be interesting thought experiment to think about whether if preservation and heritage and organizations that have tended to use those words changed to using words like placekeeping,
Right.
that would impact the work that they do, the kind of partners that they have, the way that they prioritize the work. Yeah, I think it's a great, kind of new way of thinking about what is so valuable and important about preservation that maybe kind of gives it a different twist, or, kind of gets away with some of the problems of the field, the way it's operated.
Yeah, and and I think placemaking obviously is a term that probably is more widely used in placekeeping, particularly I guess among designers. Um, but for placemaking assumes that there isn't anything there, like there's something to be made.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think a lot of our rural communities are a prime example. To the naked eye, it could appear as if it's an empty space.
Yeah.
But there's so much that already has occurred there, and it continues to exist, and there are connections, invisible connections that exist that are worth retaining.
Yeah. What's the power washing project?
Mm-hmm.
Is that, I'm really intrigued by that, because I'm wondering if you went with power washing because it gets away with, I don't know, does it get you out of having to get permits, or having something categorized as destruction of property or something like that allows you a lot of freedom? And how long does that stick? Because I think that's that I've never seen a project that used the power washing technique, and that's really, very rich.
And the only reason I said I would never do it again was because it logistically it was a lot. But if I could assist someone in doing it again, I would definitely do that. I mean, so there are a couple of reasons why we chose power washing. It actually does last a lot longer than, like, say, chalking or like temporary paint. I was surprised even how long. I mean, this was 5, 6, 7 months after you were still able to go by and see this text on the sidewalks. And I think there was something symbolic too about power washing that was really important for this project. This idea that you're uncovering history that had been submerged, and being able to remove dirt from the surface to reveal a kind of deeper meaning, a different message that may have been lost over time.
Yeah,
was really important to us. And then I think even the title, Unseen Seaville, and I'm going to forget the essay, but it was inspired by James Baldwin essay. I think it's maybe called like The Art of Teaching, 1963. But in it he talks about the responsibility of artists, and one of the main responsibilities is helping others see the things that we fail to see. And I'm forgetting the exact words he used. Obviously, Baldwin used incredible rhetoric to describe this idea, but it's also a kind of an act of love too, to help others see the things that they can't see, the things that lie beneath the visible.
Yeah.
So with that, the inspiration, being able to incorporate the quotes from the fires this time, and then also the power washing and the physical aspect of removing dirt to reveal truth.
Yeah.
That all resonated.
Yeah. Erica, I can see that you had a question, so you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like to ask it. That would be great. And if you feel like it, you can turn your camera on.
And I did see Joby, Marissa, I saw you put Joby had given a talk.
Yeah, she did. Yeah.
So Joby, Joby's, I guess, a partner in crime. I definitely credit her with, I guess, increasing my appreciation for, I guess, really increasing my appreciation for architecture, I think, really. And I think all the things about kind of the profession that really should be changed. I think she is approaching it in a way that challenges a lot of the norms that are taught in most architectural programs. But I'm going to be with her tomorrow and Saturday and Sunday. We're working on a project now, and pandemic has altered it quite a bit, but the National Trust for Historic Preservation African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund is supporting a public history institute that we're co-leading. And so essentially, we're taking her work and the work I've done around descendant engagement, and we're working with descendants who are connected to 5 other Virginia sites, and really providing them with kind of like a kind of a 101, course in, I would say, decolonized public history. Really highlighting, the aspects that we feel should be changed, and trying our best to position them, position these descendants so that when they enter into these co-stewardship agreements, there's a vocabulary that they already have. There's a kind of a background knowledge and grounding that they already have to advocate as strongly as possible and be as effective as possible.
That sounds amazing. Erica, did you have a question you want to ask?
Hi, yes, I think it kind of picks up on the coattails of what you were just speaking of, but I'm very curious as to the ways that you kind of are able to flip the script when you're engaging with communities, and especially the public, that are stakeholders in a cultural heritage that is maybe not the dominant narrative, or in cultural spaces where that narrative is flipping. And I was listening to a lecture recently, I believe there was an archaeologist associated with Jamestown that was talking about engaging people in the locality that have a cultural tie and have descendants that were enslaved on the property, that felt very intimidated and very unwelcomed by the current physical state of the heritage landscape. And how do you engage a public that might not be ready or might not be prepared or have the tools to engage or to feel welcome in those spaces? Are there certain field methods that you utilize?
Mm-hmm. How do we engage? I mean, I think, and I think it's cliche to say this at this point, but representation does matter. I think some of the reasons I've been able to be effective connect back to my identity. And so when it's me engaging, Black community or rural community, there's a different response. And I mean, there are places and communities throughout Virginia that I would definitely struggle to connect with. And I'll say this: I am an introvert. Today's conversation makes me very nervous. But one of the things that I realized early on is that for me to get other people passionate about this and to see themselves in this work, I had to kind of put myself out there a little bit more, and I had to be vulnerable and be willing to talk more about my own family history. And so it isn't, if I'm talking to, let's say, a Black person, and I'm talking to them about the importance of these sites and reclaiming these sites, I can speak from a personal perspective. And, again, my background has, for most of my career, has been in public, civil rights history. Me becoming an advocate for descendant-led stewardship here in Virginia really emerged because of a colleague of mine, who was a radio producer, and she asked if she could interview me. I mean, she's a close friend of mine. She's no longer work together, and it was a personal conversation that then got broadcast. You forget sometimes when you're. But in doing that, this was in 2017, 2018. I mean, the response that I received, and you can find it. It's called Invisible Founders, and the show is called With Good Reason. In hindsight, when I look back and I listened to that conversation, I was like, wow, I was really putting it all out there about how I felt. I mean, I met the current owners of the plantation that my family was enslaved on, one of these plantations, and the current owners are descendants of the white family that had enslaved my ancestors. I mean, that was a surprise, but in talking through that, I think I've been surprised by the response of folks who are saying, I want to do that as well. I want to figure out where my family had been enslaved. I want to visit the site. I want to confront the trauma of that place. I want to overcome the inherited trauma by confronting that history. And so I think the more diversity we bring to this work, I think the more we're able to excite the public and get them involved and really see themselves in this work. I'm excited. I have two new colleagues who will be joining me next week. One of whom, her family is Japanese American, and she's done a lot of research around Asian communities in the South. And another colleague who's joining me is Puerto Rican, and and these are communities that I could engage, and I think I'm pretty personable. I think I can engage them rather effectively, but nothing replaces having someone from your community be the one who's reaching out to you and talking about this work. And I would say even for my white colleagues, Peter Hedlund, who directs Encyclopedia Virginia, I think he was very intentional in inviting me to be a part of this work. I think he understood that as a white man, 316 slave dwellings, it could raise some questions, and people will look at that at a certain way. But I think it was important to make sure that I was involved in helping lead that work, and it wasn't just him out there in the field.
Yeah. I think Sarah, you also had a question, and I also just wanted to read from the chat box. Mary Lou says, for an introvert, you are knocking this out of the park.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, Sarah, did you have a question too?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Justin, for your talk. Sarah from the State Preservation Office here in Rhode Island. I have one question I asked about the feminist audit, and I think you said that was about your programs at Virginia Humanities.
I did.
But I was also just wondering about kind of what your formal and connections are with the Virginia SHPO.
Ooh, okay. So my connection to our SHPO is actually increased significantly, I would say, in the last few years because of this task force. And I didn't even really go into the background behind this task force. So, I'll just say Virginia Humanities, we operate as this kind of quasi-governmental nonprofit. We're connected not only to NEH, but also to state government. And when the legislation was passed to establish this task force, the enabling legislation made us the staff, essentially, for this task force. My office is the primary staff, but all of Virginia Humanities supports the work of the task force. And there are several state agencies that were legislated to be a part of this task force. So in addition to Virginia Humanities, our SHPO is a member, Virginia Tourism is a member. Shoot, I'm blanking. I'm gonna blame my newborn right now for me not being able to rattle off, because at one point in time I could rattle off every state agency. That the Virginia Outdoors Foundation, which is again another quasi-governmental nonprofit, but they're able to use their funding to preserve and purchase large tracts of land. So we're all on the African American Cultural Resources Task Force. All of these organizations are represented, and so the thing that has come out of it is really we're on the same page a lot more than we have been in the past. We're picking up the phone a lot more, is kind of de-siloing the work around preserving, protecting these Black heritage sites. And I think it's also having a kind of a ripple effect in other ways as well, for other communities. But I was just on the phone last Thursday with staff from SHPO. Right now we have a graduate student intern. Part of our hours will be with Virginia Humanities. Part of our hours are with SHPO. We're collaboratively working on. So Marissa, I was talking about the Curatescape earlier. So the project that we're working on now is really to kind of reorganize a lot of the data that we've collected around Black sites and incorporate them into the work that Virginia Tourism is doing in order to promote these sites to Black travelers, especially. We've been engaged in a lot of work around ensuring that Virginia is a truly welcoming place. So the Summer Institute that we're leading right now, two of the guest lecturers are SHPO staff. I'm going to be with, again, Joby and one of our SHPO archaeologists on Saturday for the Institute as we do some of these site visits. So, I think one of the beautiful things about this task force is cause us to, I think, collaborate a lot more than we have in the past, and you can see some of the synergy. And so I think we're all addressing similar issues from different angles. I think tourism focusing on kind of economic development, SHPO, our SHPO really looking more at kind of the tangible aspects of heritage, and Virginia Humanities has always been, I think, more focused on the intangible. But now, I think like a lot of places, right, taking a more holistic approach, you see how all of this is integrated, the intangible to tangible, environmental justice, economic development, all these things really should be in conversation with one another because they're all related.
Thank you for that. And then my other question was separate, just about like that feminist audit. Was that of humanities programs, or how did you?
It is. So we have an Encyclopedia Virginia. So I guess first I should say my office, the Office of Community Initiatives, is the office within our organization that's responsible for our statewide outreach and engagement and partnerships, partnership management and building. And so I get to connect folks with a lot of the incredible programs that are happening within Virginia Humanities, and Encyclopedia Virginia is one of them. And my colleague, Miranda Bennett, you can Google her, you can find her on the website. Miranda Bennett is working hard to do a complete feminist audit of the encyclopedia. And this encyclopedia, encyclopedias are not sexy. I know that, like, especially these days when you have Google at your fingertip, but even in Virginia, when you look at the battles that have occurred around Confederate monuments, I think we have been shocked by the hits that encyclopedia has gotten, and we're seeing it appear in news stories across the country. Activists who are on the ground are citing this work. We've had some people try to defund Virginia Humanities because we referred to white supremacy, and we connected white supremacy and United Daughters of the Confederacy in one of our entries. This was years ago. Who knew we'd be here? So I think the encyclopedia is just, the Encyclopedia Virginia is just a phenomenal resource, and they're really doing some cutting edge things around, again, kind of digital documentation of historic sites, and really kind of connecting these stories to particular places around the state.
Elizabeth, did you want to kind of voice some of the things that you were putting in the chat box? I don't know if you're able to. Yeah.
Sure. First of all, hello from the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, Justin. It's really wonderful to have you here, and thank you. Yeah, thank you. There's been so much about, I'm not even going to say the phrase because I think it's so wrong and ideologically charged, but the current culture war over the teaching of American history. And it seems that that this focus on placekeeping and storytelling, memory, identity, and experience kind of can really, dislodge how that's playing, the attack on narratives of American history that emphasize its complexity, emphasize the significance of the history of slavery and racial oppression. And I just, if you have thoughts about that, I'd love to hear.
Virginia is very unique right now. I guess everybody is aware, maybe, I don't know, maybe not. We had a controversy a couple of years ago with our governor, the images of possibly him in blackface or a Klan robe. We're still not quite sure. But that that kind of scandal, I guess I should say, became an impetus for so much. You know, he was Governor Ralph Northam. He was determined to really kind of reckon with his own, what should I say? I mean, kind of his own historical misunderstandings. I think, you know, he realized that there were huge gaps in his own education when it came to Virginia history and race, and he wanted to really kind of double down and commit to grappling with these issues. And so out of that came what's the title? The Virginia Commission on African American History Education. I mean, they passed a bunch of recommendations to improve our state standards and to incorporate more Black history into the state standards. And those recommendations were unanimously adopted by the Virginia Department of Education. So whereas some states, it appears as if they're regressing, Virginia actually got ahead of the curve in many ways and is going in the opposite direction, partly because of that scandal, partly because of, you know, individuals like, you know, Delegate McQuinn and Senator McCullen, who, you know, just ran for governor recently. I mean, there was already a foundation there to improve how this history was being taught. So I'll say this, you know, Virginia Humanities, you know, the task force, we've really been promoting place-based learning and encouraging educators to better connect with, you know, the heritage sites in their backyards and to incorporate those sites into the curricula. I think, you know, something that I've really begun kind of emphasizing a lot more in conversations, you know, public conversations, is the difference between heritage and history. I think we've conflated those two terms, and, you know, history, there's one history, there's the history that occurred, and then there's obviously, I know I'm speaking to the choir, you know, when it comes to understanding what heritage means, and it's something that is a little bit more dynamic and open to interpretation, and it evolves and changes, and it, you know, often has an agenda, right? And so, you know, I think it's important to really ensure that people aren't conflating the two, and recognize that heritage can sometimes be a misinterpretation of what actually happened, or it can be a slightly altered, you know, memory of what truly happened. And so, you know, I think the more and more we have that conversation, the more people realize that, you know, this fight that y'all are having is really over heritage and how it's remembered, and kind of your identity and your inability to really either separate your identity from, in the South in particular, you know, some short years that were traumatic for, you know, a lot of reasons, but definitely don't represent the totality of Southern history. You have to separate the heritage conversation from the history conversation. You know, it's hard to answer that question because, frankly, you know, Virginia, at least right now, isn't having that battle. Like, our state legislature isn't, you know, trying to strip, you know, civil rights history and the history of slavery and Reconstruction from our curricula. In many ways, we're increasing that content in our focus.
Thank you, Justin. Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. We should close because we're already keeping you a few minutes past what I know you had time for. I know there was another question in the chat box from one of our alums, Amy Addick, who's now in Richmond. But I can maybe connect you guys over email for that. And I just wanted to, thanks for sharing your work. I'm sure with everyone who's here, it's just leaving everyone with sparks of inspiration in both the big sense about why we do this work and what the value is and how hard it is, but how important it is. But then also kind of a lot of the specific ways that you go about doing this to make it impactful and successful is really inspiring. So thank you for joining us. And we hope to see you again in person, maybe one day back at the center.
I hope so too. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Nice to see everyone too. Be safe. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you.
Bye.